In 1983, the music press wrote Queen off. Not reluctantly, not with caveats, completely. The Hot Space album had sold modestly and confused the audience. The American tour had not gone well. The critics were specific. Queen had lost the thread. They had chased trends, the funk influences, the disco influences, the attempt to sound like something other than what they were, and in doing so had become nothing. The band that had sold out Wembley, that had played to 300,000 people in Argentina, that had put Bohemian Rhapsody at #1 for 9 weeks, was finished. The music press said so. The industry said so. Nobody in the specific world of British rock music in 1983 was booking Queen for their festival. Nobody was predicting a comeback. Nobody was watching. And then in February 1984, Radio Gaga was released. And in October 1984, I Want to Break Free was released. And in 1985, Freddie Mercury stood at Wembley Stadium at Live Aid and did 20 minutes that Bob Geldof, David Bowie, and every musician who was there has since described the same way. The greatest live rock performance they ever witnessed. Nobody said Queen were finished after that, not once, not ever. The Hot Space album, released in May 1982, was the record that gave the critics their opening. Queen had been moving in a different direction since the game in 1980. The funk influences, the synthesizers, the deliberate attempt to make something that could live on radio stations alongside the post-disco pop of the early 1980s. Another One Bites the Dust had gone to #1 in America. It was a funk track. It worked, and Queen, encouraged by that success, went further. Hot Space was the result. Stripped of the guitar-driven rock that had defined them. Heavy on the synthesizer, the programmatic rhythm, the specific aesthetic of early 1980s dance music. Brian May has described the Hot Space period as one of the most difficult of his career, not because the music was wrong as music, but because the decision to make it had come from different members of the band pulling in different directions. Freddie Mercury wanted to push further toward the clubs and the dance music that was everywhere in Munich. Brian May wanted the guitar. The argument left marks. Hot Space left marks. And the critics, who had been watching for a sign that the juggernaut was showing cracks, found them. The Hot Space North American tour, which ran through 1982, was the last time Queen played America. Not because they chose to leave, because the specific combination of the album's muted reception, the direction arguments within the band, and the growing sense that Queen's relationship with American audiences had never been quite what it was with British or European or South American audiences, had reached a point where the calculus no longer worked. The shows were not failures. Queen did not play to empty arenas. But the specific energy of the tour, the specific chemistry between the band and the audience, was not what it had been. Brian May has described watching Freddie Mercury on stage during the Hot Space tour with the particular concern of someone who is watching a performer who is not quite in the right room. The music was not the music the audience expected. The performer was giving everything, but the fit was not there. After the tour ended, Queen did not announce they were stopping. They simply stopped booking American dates. And the music press filled the silence with what the silence invited. Queen are finished. Queen are finished. The sentence appeared in British music magazines across 1982 and 1983, with the casual certainty of people who believed they were reporting a fact rather than making a prediction. Queen had had their time. The band that had defined the second half of the 1970s in British rock, the band of Bohemian Rhapsody and We Will Rock You and Don't Stop Me Now and Crazy Little Thing Called Love, had run its course. The argument was specific. They had lost what made them Queen. The attempt to adapt to changing tastes had produced music that was neither the old Queen nor the new anything. They were in the worst possible position for a band, between their past and a future that didn't exist yet. And the critics, who are always most comfortable with a story that has already ended, wrote the ending. They were wrong. But in 1983, nobody knew that. In February 1984, Queen released Radio Gaga. It went to #2 in the UK, #1 in 19 countries. It was the first single from the works, the album that answered the question of whether Queen still existed in any meaningful sense. And the answer was, yes, completely. The works was not a nostalgic record. It was not Queen trying to recreate 1975. It was Queen at a specific point in their development, a band that had come through the hot space experiment and the American retreat and the internal arguments, and had emerged with something clearer. The guitars were back. Brian May's guitar, the Red Special, the specific sound that no other guitarist in the world could reproduce, was back at the center. Freddie Mercury's voice, which had been somewhat buried in the hot space mix, was back in front. And the songs Radio Gaga, I Want to Break Free, It's a Hard Life, Hammer to Fall were songs that knew what they were, not chasing anything, not adapting to anything, simply Queen, doing what Queen did at full power. I Want to Break Free, released in October 1984, was the second sign. John Deacon wrote it. The video Four Men in Dresses, a terraced house, a vacuum cleaner was banned by MTV in America for being too controversial. In Britain, it went to number 3. In Europe, it went higher. The specific quality of the song, the freedom in it, the joy of it, the complete security of 4 people who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, was the sound of a band that had come through the difficult years and arrived somewhere real. And the video, which the American network executives looked at and saw men in dresses, was the clearest possible statement of what had changed. Queen in 1984 was a band that did not care what you thought. That had never entirely been true of Hot Space. It was entirely true of I Want to Break Free. The critics noticed. The audience noticed. The nominations started coming back. The conversation started including Queen again. And all of this was before Live Aid. The Freddie Mercury tribute concert at Live Aid on July 13, 1985, was not the only thing that happened in the comeback, but it was the thing that settled the argument. By the time Queen took the Wembley stage at 6:41 p.m. on July 13, 1985, the works had already re-established them. Radio Gaga had already been number 1 in 19 countries. I Want to Break Free had already confirmed that the direction was correct. The band was already back, in any honest assessment of the evidence. But the music press had not quite caught up. The narrative of the decline, the hot space years, the American retreat, the critical consensus of 1983 was still attached to them. What Live Aid did was remove that narrative permanently, not by proving that Queen were commercially successful, by proving in 20 minutes in front of 1 billion television viewers and 72,000 people at Wembley that Freddie Mercury was the greatest live rock performer alive. Freddie Mercury was the greatest live rock performer alive. This is not a contested statement. It was not contested after Live Aid. Every musician who was there, Bob Geldof, David Bowie, Paul McCartney, Elton John, the full roster of what was the most impressive gathering of rock musicians in history, has said the same thing in their own words. The 20 minutes that Queen played were not simply a strong set. They were the performance that every subsequent conversation about what live rock music could be has measured itself against. Freddie Mercury took a crowd of 72,000 people and made them his instrument. He pointed and they moved. He asked for a sound, and 72,000 people produced it in unison. He played the crowd the way a pianist plays a piano, with precision, with intention, with the complete certainty of someone who has spent 20 years learning exactly what they can do and who is, in these 20 minutes, doing it. And when the 20 minutes were over, nobody wrote that Queen were finished. Nobody has written it since. The comeback of 1984 to 85 required specific and difficult internal work that the public narrative of the triumphant return does not always include. The arguments of the hot space period, the directional disagreements, the Munich situation, the specific difficulty of 4 people who had been together for 15 years and who had reached a point where the shared direction was not as clear as it had been, had to be navigated. The resolution that John Deacon had helped broker in Munich in the winter of 1983, the understanding that Freddie would make his solo album, that Queen would take time, that when they returned the dynamic would be more collaborative, was not a permanent peace. It was the beginning of a different kind of working relationship, one in which the band's identity was not entirely dependent on Freddie Mercury's willingness to subordinate everything he wanted to do to what Queen needed. The Works was the first record made in that different working relationship. The specific energy of it, the cleaner, the more focused, the band playing to its own strengths rather than chasing a trend, is the evidence that the internal work had produced something real. The specific moment at which the comeback became undeniable, the moment at which the critical consensus shifted and the narrative of the decline gave way to the narrative of the return, was not a chart position or a review. It was Live Aid. July 13th, 1985. Radio Gaga. 72,000 people in Wembley Stadium, raising their arms simultaneously. The specific gesture from the video, the arms raised. The clap performed in perfect unison by a crowd of 72,000 people who had learned it from a music video and who were now doing it live, in a stadium, in the specific electricity of one of the largest events in the history of live music. Brian May, watching from the stage, has described that moment. He has described seeing the arms go up and thinking, this is it. This is what it was always supposed to be, not the hot space experiment, not the Munich years. This. And Freddie Mercury, who was conducting the moment from the microphone, knew it too. Freddie Mercury knew it too, and the knowledge was complicated because by July 1985, Freddie Mercury already knew things that the crowd at Wembley did not know. The diagnosis would come in 1987, but the specific awareness that something was changing, the health concerns. The early signs that the hot space lifestyle of the Munich years had left marks was beginning. The comeback of 1984 to 85 was not simply a creative triumph, it was a race between the creative return and the physical decline that was coming. Freddie Mercury won the race. The Works, I Want to Break Free, Radio Gaga, Live Aid, all of it before the decline became the story. And in winning the race, he gave the band and the audience something that nobody in 1983 had predicted was still possible. The greatest performance of his career. At the moment when the critics had written him off, at the moment when he most needed to prove they were wrong, he proved it. Completely. After Live Aid, the critical narrative reversed completely. The magazines that had written Queen off in 1983 wrote about the Live Aid performance with the specific language of people who are correcting the record. Not apologies, critics do not apologize. But the acknowledgement in the reviews and the retrospectives and the year-end assessments that what had seemed like a decline had been something else, a regrouping, a recalibration, the specific necessary difficulty of a band that had been going at full speed for 15 years and that had needed to stop, to argue, to go to Munich and have the conversations that almost broke them in order to find the version of themselves that would walk onto the Wembley stage in July 1985 and do what they did. The Works went platinum, a kind of magic. The next album, in 1986, went to #1. The Magic Tour sold out stadiums across Europe and ended with the Nebworth concert, 120,000 people, the largest paid concert in British history at the time. Nobody was writing that Queen were finished. The comeback of 1984 to 85 is the template for every subsequent narrative about Queen's career. The moment the story turns the downward line becoming an upward line again. But the lesson is not simply that comebacks are possible. The lesson is more specific. The difficulty was not a detour from the real story, it was the real story. Without hot space, there is no Works. Without the Munich crisis, there is no I Want to Break Free. Without the directional arguments that nearly broke the band, there is no Live Aid performance that put it back together. The comeback was not a return to what Queen had been before the difficult years. It was the specific thing that the difficult years produced. The Works was not a nostalgia record. It was the album that could only have been made by a band that had been through exactly what Queen had been through. The album that could only have been made by a band that had been through exactly what Queen had been through. This is the thing the critics missed in 1983. They saw the hot space difficulties as evidence of decline. They were actually evidence of something more complicated and more interesting. A band in the middle of becoming the next version of itself. Every major career has these moments. The transition between what you were and what you're going to be is always uncomfortable. It is always legible as decline to the people who are watching from the outside, and who cannot see where the arc is going. The critics in 1983 were watching from the outside. They saw the discomfort. They called it the end. They were wrong by 2 years. In 1985 at Live Aid, they understood what they had missed. The band that was supposedly finished in 1983 had spent 2 years becoming the band that would do the greatest live rock performance in the history of the form. The difficulty was the preparation. The critics called it the end. It was the beginning. In 1983, the music press wrote, "Queen off." Every critic, every industry person, everyone who was supposed to know Queen had lost the thread. Queen had chased trends. Queen were finished. They were wrong. In February 1984, Radio Gaga went to #1 in 19 countries. In October 1984, I Want to Break Free confirmed the direction. In July 1985, Freddie Mercury stood at Wembley and did 20 minutes that nobody who was there has ever been able to properly describe. Bob Geldof said it was the greatest thing he had ever seen. David Bowie said the same. Every musician who was there said the same. And the critics who had written Queen off in 1983 wrote about Live Aid with the specific language of people who are trying not to say they were wrong. They had been wrong. Completely. The band they declared finished in 1983 went on to play the greatest live performance in the history of rock music. The band they walked away from made the works, made a kind of magic, made innuendo, made Made in Heaven. Nobody said Queen were finished after Live Aid. Not once, not ever. They were right not to say it. They should have been right not to say it in 1983.